Imagine standing at the edge of a 14-story window in a Manhattan penthouse, looking out over the city that has always known your name. Not because of anything you built, anything you wrote, anything you chose, but simply because of who you were born to. Imagine carrying that name like a crown that was also a cage. Imagine watching your mother, the most photographed woman in America, look right through you while the cameras captured her perfect smile. Imagine being told your whole life that you are extraordinary, that the blood in your veins is blue enough to open any door in the world, and then discovering, slowly and painfully, that no amount of wealth or pedigree can protect a child from the one thing they need most. This is not just a story about money. This is a story about what happens to the children left behind in the wake of a glamorous life. It is a story about 4 sons, each shaped by the same woman, each wounded in ways that took decades to understand. It is a story about Anderson Cooper, one of the most trusted voices in American journalism, who spent years asking hard questions on television while carrying the hardest question of all quietly inside himself. And it is a story about Carter Cooper, a young man who had everything and still could not find a reason to stay. The Vanderbilt name echoes through American history like a cathedral bell. Rich, deep, impossible to ignore. But inside that cathedral, the light did not always reach the corners. And in those dark corners, 4 boys grew up trying to figure out who they were beyond the name, beyond the fortune, beyond the mother who loved them in the only way she knew how. Before we go any further into this story, if you are new here and you love deep dives into the lives of extraordinary families, the kind of stories that go beyond headlines and into the real human experience, please take a moment to subscribe. This channel is built for people who want to understand the world at a deeper level. And this story, in particular, is one of the most layered, most heartbreaking, and most illuminating journeys we have ever explored together. Now let us go back to where it all began. Gloria Vanderbilt did not choose to be born into one of the wealthiest families in American history. She simply arrived, in 1924, into a world that treated wealth as destiny and beauty as currency. Her father, Reginald Claypole Vanderbilt, was the great-great-grandson of Cornelius Vanderbilt, the railroad tycoon who had accumulated a fortune so vast that it reshaped the entire American economy in the 19th century. By the time Gloria was born, the Vanderbilt fortune had already been significantly diminished by generations of extravagant spending, but the name itself remained worth more than most people would earn in a lifetime. Reginald died when Gloria was just a year and a half old, leaving behind a trust fund for his infant daughter and a wife who was beautiful, social, and completely unprepared for motherhood. Gloria's mother, also named Gloria, was a stunning woman who loved parties, travel, and the company of wealthy Europeans far more than she loved the domestic responsibilities of raising a child. The baby Gloria was largely handed off to a nurse named Dodo, who became the most consistent maternal figure in her early years. Her own mother was a glittering presence, someone who swept in and out of rooms, trailing perfume and glamour, but never quite settling long enough to simply hold her daughter's hand. What followed was one of the most sensational custody battles in American legal history. When Gloria was 10 years old, her maternal aunt, Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney, a sculptor and arts patron, filed for custody of the child. The trial was lurid and public and brutal in the way only early 20th century tabloid journalism could be. Gloria's mother was painted as a negligent, morally questionable socialite. The child herself was put on the stand. And in the end, the court awarded custody to Gertrude, ruling that the little girl would be better off in a stable American household than trailing across Europe with her butterfly mother. Think about what that does to a child. Think about being 10 years old and sitting in a courtroom while lawyers argue over your body, your life, your worth as a human being. Think about watching your mother be torn apart in public, watching strangers vote on who should raise you, watching yourself become the most famous orphan in America while your mother sat just across the room. Gloria Vanderbilt would carry that courtroom with her for the rest of her life. And without fully realizing it, she would pass the echoes of it onto her children. She grew into a remarkable woman by almost any measure. She was an artist, a writer, a designer, an actress, a poet. She fell in love with a reckless intensity that alarmed people around her, and married 4 times. Her first marriage was at 17, a brief and disastrous union with a Hollywood agent named Pasquale Di Cicco, who was allegedly abusive. Her second was to the conductor Leopold Stokowski, who was 63 years old when she married him at 21. They had 2 sons together, Leopold Stanislaus Stokowski and Christopher Stokowski, both born in the late 1940s. Her third marriage was to the director Sidney Lumet, which also ended in divorce. And then came Wyatt Emery Cooper, a writer and actor from Mississippi who came from no particular fortune or fame, but who possessed the kind of deep, steady love that Gloria had been searching for since she was a little girl sitting in a courtroom, watching strangers decide her fate. With Wyatt, she had 2 more sons, Carter Vanderbilt Cooper, born in 1965, and Anderson Hayes Cooper, born in 1967. 4 boys. 4 different chapters in the story of a woman trying to give her children what she never had while simultaneously making all the mistakes that only a mother who never had a mother herself could make. The Stokowski boys, Stan and Christopher, grew up first. They were the sons of Gloria's most unconventional match, a relationship that had scandalized New York society when it began. Leopold Stokowski was a legendary conductor, a man of tremendous artistic ego and immense personal magnetism, but he was not built for fatherhood in any conventional sense. He was already in the late season of his life when his sons were born. He was old enough to be their grandfather, and when the marriage to Gloria dissolved, the boys were left in a situation that mirrored their mother's own childhood in unsettling ways. Stan Stokowski, the older of the 2, grew up quiet and observant. He watched his mother move through marriages and media attention and artistic reinvention with the eyes of someone trying to understand a language they were never fully taught. Christopher Stokowski was different in temperament, but similarly shadowed by the sense that his family, for all its wealth and beauty, was missing something essential. Something warm. Something that simply stayed. It is important to understand, before going any further, that Gloria Vanderbilt was not a villain. She was not a cold or calculating woman. By most accounts, she was genuinely affectionate, genuinely creative, genuinely passionate about the people she loved. But she had grown up without a model for consistent maternal presence. She had been raised by an aunt, shaped by nannies, defined by a courtroom, and she had learned from her earliest years that love was something you received in glimpses, something that arrived dressed in beauty and left without warning. She replicated those patterns not out of cruelty, but out of the only emotional vocabulary she had ever been given. And so her children grew up in households of extraordinary privilege, surrounded by beautiful things, exposed to art and culture and sophistication from the moment they could walk. They attended the best schools. They wore the right clothes. They moved through rooms that ordinary people would never see the inside of. And they also grew up feeling, each in their own way, that they were always slightly on the outside of the warmth they needed most. By the time Anderson and Carter Cooper came along in the mid-1960s, Gloria was in what would prove to be the most stable and loving chapter of her romantic life. Wyatt Cooper was a genuinely good man. People who knew him described him as thoughtful, literary, deeply kind. He wrote a memoir called Families, which was essentially a love letter to the idea of connection, belonging, and the meaning of home. He was, in many ways, everything that Gloria had grown up without. And for a period of years, the family they built together in their Manhattan apartment felt like something real and lasting. Anderson Cooper has spoken about his father with a reverence that is unmistakable. Wyatt Cooper was the kind of father who told his sons stories, who sat with them, who made them feel like their thoughts and feelings mattered. In a family where so much was about image and legacy and the weight of a famous name, Wyatt was the counterweight. He was the gravity that kept everything from spinning off into orbit, but gravity, like everything else, is temporary. In January of 1978, Wyatt Cooper underwent open heart surgery at New York University Medical Center. He was 50 years old. Anderson was 10 years old. Carter was 12. The surgery was supposed to be manageable, the kind of procedure that modern medicine had made relatively routine. But Wyatt Cooper died on the operating table. And with him died the one constant in a household that had always been, in some quiet but significant way, slightly unsteady. Anderson Cooper has described the moment his father died as one of the defining experiences of his life. He was a child, and he lost the person who had made the world feel safe. And what came after was a grief that he did not fully understand how to carry, in a family that did not fully understand how to talk about pain. Gloria Vanderbilt was devastated. She had loved Wyatt Cooper more honestly than she had loved perhaps anyone. But her way of processing devastation had always been to keep moving, to keep creating, to keep presenting beauty to the world as a way of surviving it. And her sons, Carter and Anderson, were left to grieve in the shadow of a woman who was herself drowning while trying very hard to look like she was swimming. The 1970s were a strange and glittering decade for Gloria. Even as she navigated personal grief and the challenge of raising 2 young boys as a widow, she transformed herself once again, this time into a fashion icon. Her designer jeans, branded with her signature on the back pocket, became one of the most successful fashion ventures of the decade. The Gloria Vanderbilt jean was everywhere. Her face was on billboards. Her name was on millions of pairs of pants. She was, at a time when her heart was privately broken, more publicly famous than she had ever been. And there is something deeply human about that paradox. The way that public triumph and private devastation can exist in the same body at the same time. The way that fame can become a kind of armor. The way that creating beautiful things for the world to see can feel like the only language available when the internal one has gone completely silent. Carter and Anderson watched their mother become a brand. They watched the cameras and the attention and the magazine covers. They were Vanderbilt Cooper boys, which meant they moved through the world with a certain ease that came from money and connections and the right last name. Carter, the older of the two, was attending Princeton. He was described by people who knew him as bright and sensitive and searching. He had his father's literary sensibility and his mother's artistic intensity, which is a combination that can be magnificent or combustible depending on the circumstances. Anderson was different. Quieter, more contained, more watchful. As a teenager, he had done something that surprised people who knew the family. He had walked into a modeling agency and begun working as a model. Not because he needed the money, obviously, but because he needed something of his own. Some identity that was separate from the Vanderbilt name and the Cooper grief and the weight of all that inherited expectation. He was, even as a teenager, trying to build himself from the inside out rather than the outside in. But July 22, 1988 changed everything. It was a summer evening. Gloria Vanderbilt was at her penthouse apartment on East 67th Street in Manhattan. Carter was there with her. He was 23 years old. He had graduated from Princeton, was working as a writer at a magazine, and was, by all outward appearances, a young man with the world arranged in his favor. But something was happening inside Carter Cooper that no one around him fully understood. There had been signs. There had been moments of darkness, of searching, of a weight that seemed to press down on him in ways that couldn't be explained by logic or circumstance. On that July evening, Carter walked out onto the terrace of his mother's 14th floor apartment, and he jumped. Gloria Vanderbilt saw it happen. She was standing just feet away, and she could not stop it. The loss of Carter Cooper is the kind of event that rearranges everything around it. It is a gravitational collapse, the kind that pulls all subsequent meaning into its orbit. Every story about the Vanderbilt children must pass through July 22, 1988. Every understanding of who Anderson Cooper became, every understanding of how Gloria spent the rest of her life, every question about what money and privilege can and cannot protect you from, runs directly through that date. Carter was buried at a private service. Gloria was reportedly so shattered that she could barely function. She later wrote about his death in her memoir, trying to find language for something that resisted language entirely. She described his eyes in the moments before he jumped. She described the way he looked at her. She described a grief so total and so permanent that it rewired her understanding of everything she thought she knew about love and loss, and the limits of what a mother can do. Anderson Cooper was 20 years old when his brother died. He was studying political science at Yale, and in the way of people who grow up with grief already installed in them from a young age, He did not break apart visibly. He turned inward, and then he turned outward toward work in a way that would come to define the rest of his life. It is worth pausing here and asking the question that hangs over this entire story. Why? Why Carter? What was it that a 23-year-old man with extraordinary resources and a family that loved him could not find? What was missing? And could anything have filled it? The honest answer is that we will never know with certainty. Carter Cooper did not leave behind a detailed explanation. He left behind a grief-stricken mother, a surviving brother, 2 older half-brothers, and a question that echoes through every subsequent chapter of this family's story. The question of whether the weight of a famous name, the pressure of inherited expectation, and the particular emotional climate of growing up Vanderbilt was simply, for Carter, too much to carry. There is a kind of cruelty that is particular to wealth when it comes to mental health. When someone who appears to have everything is suffering, the suffering becomes illegitimate in the eyes of the world. People ask, sometimes with genuine bewilderment, and sometimes with barely concealed contempt, what could possibly be wrong? What could you possibly lack? And the person suffering learns very quickly that their pain will not be received with sympathy by most of the world. So they carry it alone. They carry it in the penthouse apartments, and the Ivy League dormitories, and the beautiful rooms that money builds. And sometimes the weight of carrying it alone, invisibly, in a world that cannot see why you would possibly hurt, becomes unbearable. Gloria Vanderbilt survived her son's death the way she survived everything. She created, she painted, she wrote, she loved still, even after everything. But she was never entirely whole again. How could she be? A mother who watches her child die, in that particular way, in that particular moment, carries something that does not heal. It changes shape over time. It becomes part of the architecture of the person. But it does not go away. The 2 older Stokowski sons had by this point been estranged from their mother for some years. The nature of that estrangement was complex, rooted in the particular difficulties of being children from a marriage that ended when they were young, of sharing a mother with subsequent husbands and subsequent children, of growing up in the long shadow of a woman whose public persona was enormous and whose private self was sometimes difficult to access. Stan Stokowski lived relatively quietly away from the spotlight. Christopher Stokowski, meanwhile, had built a life that was almost entirely separate from the Vanderbilt world. It was Christopher's estrangement that would become one of the most quietly heartbreaking threads in this entire story. Because Christopher did not simply drift away in the organic way that adult children sometimes do. He disappeared deliberately. He changed his last name. He built a life in which the name Vanderbilt and the legacy it carried had no place. He cut off contact with his mother for decades. Not because he was a cruel person, but because, one imagines, the weight of what it meant to be her son was something he needed to put down in order to survive. Think about that for a moment. Think about the decision to erase your own last name. To look at the name you were born with, the name that carries wealth and history and public recognition, and decide that it is doing you more harm than good. That is not a small thing. That is a profound statement about identity and survival and the cost of a famous family. Gloria Vanderbilt spoke publicly about the loss of Christopher, about how deeply it pained her to be estranged from her own child. She spent years hoping for reconciliation. And in one of the most quietly moving moments of this entire story, a reconciliation did eventually come, very late in Gloria's life, in the years before she died. Christopher returned. They found each other again. Whether it was enough, whether the years of absence were forgiven or simply accepted, only they could say. But the fact of the reunion speaks to something stubborn and human in both of them. The fact that even after everything, the pull toward the original connection was still there. Anderson Cooper, meanwhile, was building something extraordinary out of the ruins of his own private losses. After Carter's death, Anderson left Yale, took a year, and then did something that caught people off guard. He did not retreat into the Vanderbilt world of society and philanthropy and inherited wealth. He went to war zones. He forged fake press credentials, flew to Myanmar, which was then called Burma, and began reporting on a civil conflict that most Americans had never heard of. He was 22 years old, alone, with a camera and an idea that if he could get the footage, someone would use it. It worked. He sold his footage to Channel One, a news organization that broadcast to high schools, and he found his calling. He had discovered that the way to manage the enormous, private grief he carried was to go toward the pain of others, not to run from darkness, but to shine a light directly into it. He became a war correspondent. He went to Somalia during the famine. He went to Rwanda during the genocide. He went to the places where the worst things that human beings do to each other were happening, and he stood there, and he bore witness. There is a psychological theory about this kind of behavior that is worth understanding. When people experience traumatic loss early in life, particularly loss that involves helplessness, the inability to prevent something terrible from happening, some of them develop a powerful drive to be present at the scenes of catastrophe. Not because they are drawn to suffering for its own sake, but because being present, being the person who shows up and refuses to look away, is a way of doing something. It is the antidote to the helplessness of standing on a terrace in Manhattan at 20 years old and not being there, not being able to do anything, when your brother's life ended. Anderson Cooper has never stated this analysis as explicitly as that. He is a private man about his deepest interior, but the pattern of his career speaks volumes. He became the person who goes toward the crisis. He was on the ground in New Orleans during Hurricane Katrina, and his coverage of that disaster became legendary not just because of his reporting, but because of the moment when the emotion broke through. When he confronted a senator who was speaking in the polished, managed language of politics about a catastrophe that was killing people who had been abandoned, and Anderson Cooper simply told the truth. He was angry. He was present. He was human on camera in a way that news anchors rarely allowed themselves to be, and the audience felt it, because the audience could sense that this was not performed emotion. This was a man who had lived inside grief. This was a man who knew what it felt like when the official story and the real story were two entirely different things. This was a man who had sat with loss at close range for most of his life, and who had decided, somewhere deep in the architecture of himself, that bearing witness to the truth was the only way he knew how to honor it. He became the anchor of CNN's Anderson Cooper 360. He became one of the most recognizable journalists in America. He came out publicly as gay in 2012 in a letter to the Daily Beast, written with characteristic understatement and emotional precision. He noted that he had always tried to protect his privacy, but that the world had changed enough that he felt the silence was doing more harm than good. He said simply, clearly, without drama, that he was a gay man. It was a moment that mattered, not just personally but culturally, because Anderson Cooper was at that point one of the most trusted figures in American public life, and visibility from people in positions like his carries weight. His mother responded publicly with love and pride. And that response illuminated something important about Gloria Vanderbilt. For all her complexity, for all the ways she fell short as a mother in certain crucial moments, she was never someone who would diminish her children for who they were. She had lived her own unconventional life too fully and too publicly to sit in judgment of anyone else's truth. She celebrated Anderson's coming out the way she celebrated most things, with an openness that was genuine even if it sometimes arrived later than it should have. The relationship between Anderson Cooper and his mother is one of the most fascinating elements of this entire story. He wrote about it honestly in a book they co-authored together called The Rainbow Comes and Goes, which was published in 2016. The book grew out of an email correspondence. The two of them began after Gloria suffered a minor health scare when Anderson, facing the reality of her age and his own fear of losing her the way he had lost his father and his brother, decided he needed to actually talk to her, not in the way families talk at holiday dinners, not in the performance of family togetherness, but in the real way, the difficult way, the way that required asking questions and sitting with answers that were sometimes uncomfortable. The result was remarkable. The book is a portrait of a relationship being rebuilt in real time, two people from the same family who had lived in the same apartment, but in some ways had never fully known each other. choosing in the later chapters of their shared story to actually look at each other clearly. Anderson asked his mother about her childhood, about the custody battle, about what it had felt like to be that little girl in that courtroom, about Carter, about the marriages. About all the things that families usually agree, without ever saying so, never to discuss directly. And Gloria answered. She answered with the honesty of someone who had spent a lifetime processing her own story through art and writing, and who was, in the final decades of her life, ready to be seen without the filter of glamour and public image. She was, by the time the book was written, a woman in her 90s who had buried a husband and a son and been estranged from 2 other sons, and who had survived all of it by refusing to stop creating. The book is tender and painful and occasionally funny. It is the kind of conversation that most families never manage to have, and the fact that this particular family had it on the page, for the world to read, was both an act of extraordinary courage and a final gift. But even as Anderson and Gloria were building this late chapter closeness, the shadow of everything that had come before was always present. Carter was always present. He is the absent one in every room of this family's story. The one who did not make it to the reconciliations and the honest conversations and the late life clarity. The one who jumped before any of that was possible. Anderson Cooper became a father in 2020 when his son Wyatt Morgan Cooper was born via surrogate. He named the boy after his father. It was one of the most overtly emotional public statements he had ever made, a deliberate, permanent inscription of his father's name into the next generation. Wyatt Emery Cooper had died when Anderson was 10 years old. Anderson waited 53 years and then handed his father's name to his son. If you want to understand the depth of a loss, sometimes you only need to look at what a person does with the names they give their children. Gloria Vanderbilt met Wyatt Morgan Cooper briefly before her death. She was in her 90s, and she met her grandson and she held him. Anderson has spoken about that moment with the kind of carefully contained emotion that is characteristic of him. You can hear, beneath the measured words, how much it meant that she got to hold a baby named Wyatt, how much it meant that the name came full circle. Gloria Vanderbilt died on June 17, 2019. She was 95 years old. She had been diagnosed with advanced stomach cancer in the spring of that year and had declined relatively quickly. Anderson was with her at the end. He sat with her. He held her hand. He did not look away. He went on CNN the morning after her death and told the world that she was gone, speaking about her with the kind of love and complexity that only comes from genuinely knowing someone. He talked about her creativity and her resilience and her extraordinary will to live and experience and create. He talked about how she had faced death with a kind of equanimity that surprised even him. He said that she was ready, that she had made her peace, that she had lived on her own terms all the way to the end. And then, in the way of Anderson Cooper, he went back to work. The question of the Vanderbilt fortune and what happened to it is one that often comes up in discussions of this family, and it is worth addressing directly because it complicates the simple narrative of inherited wealth. By the time Gloria Vanderbilt died, the fortune that Cornelius Vanderbilt had built in the 19th century had long since been dispersed across generations of spending, legal battles, failed ventures, and the basic entropy that tends to erode even the largest fortunes over time. Gloria herself had earned significant money through her own career, particularly through the jeans business, but she had also spent money with the freedom of someone who grew up believing that money was simply the water you swam in. It was always there, until it wasn't quite as much. Anderson Cooper revealed publicly, after his mother's death, that he had not inherited a large fortune. He was surprised, he said. Not devastated, but surprised. He had known that his mother had spent freely, but the extent of what remained was less than he had expected. He spoke about it not with bitterness, but with a kind of philosophical acceptance. He had made his own money. He had built his own career. The Vanderbilt fortune was not something he had ever allowed himself to rely on, emotionally or practically, because relying on inherited things had always seemed to him like a way of not fully becoming yourself. And this is, perhaps, the most quietly important thing about Anderson Cooper in the context of this entire story. He is the son who did the work. He is the son who took the grief and the loss and the weight of the famous name and transformed it into something of his own making. He is not the Vanderbilt heir in the traditional sense. He is something rarer and more interesting. He is the person who emerged from an extraordinary and extraordinarily difficult family history and built, from the wreckage and the wonder of it, a life that is genuinely, unmistakably his. But we should not let that narrative of triumph become a reason to minimize what was lost along the way. Anderson Cooper's success does not redeem the losses. It does not bring back Carter. It does not make the years of Christopher's estrangement painless. It does not undo the loneliness that each of these boys carried, in their different ways, through childhoods that were spectacular and sometimes hollow. Success is not a solution to grief. It is simply what some people build in the space where grief has cleared everything else away. Stan Stokowski, the eldest of Gloria's 4 sons, has lived the most private life of all of them. He stepped back from any public connection to the Vanderbilt legacy decades ago and has lived in a way that suggests he made peace with the distance. There is wisdom in that, perhaps, the wisdom of knowing what you can carry and what you cannot. The wisdom of choosing a life that fits the actual shape of who you are, rather than the shape that your name suggests you should be. Christopher Stokowski's story, bookended by that long estrangement and the eventual reconciliation, is its own meditation on the cost of inheritance. What does it mean to cut off your own origin? What does it mean to reclaim it, decades later, when the woman who gave you life is approaching the end of hers? There are no clean answers. There is only the human complexity of 2 people who hurt each other in ways that were probably not entirely conscious, finding their way back to each other across the distance of decades, and deciding, at the last possible moment, that the connection still mattered. Gloria Vanderbilt was many things. She was a child who was publicly auctioned off to the higher bidder by the American legal system while the tabloids watched. She was a young woman of extraordinary beauty who learned early that beauty was both a gift and a trap. She was an artist who worked in collage and paint and fabric and language, who channeled her inner life into colors and shapes, because sometimes that was the only way to make the interior visible. She was a businesswoman who turned her own name into a profitable brand at a time when few women were doing that. She was a mother who loved her children and who failed them in some of the most important ways, and who spent decades trying to understand the distance between those 2 facts. She was a survivor, 4 times over at least. She survived the custody battle. She survived the loss of her 4th husband. She survived the death of her son. She survived the estrangement of her other sons. She survived and she created, right up until the end. She was painting in her 90s. She was writing poetry. She was refusing, with every brushstroke and every line of verse, to let the losses have the last word. There is something almost mythological about Gloria Vanderbilt when you step back and look at the full arc of her life. She was the American princess who never quite had a home. She was the mother who gave her children everything and somehow also gave them a particular, unnamed hunger. She was the artist who transmuted pain into color. She was the woman who outlived her son, her husband, her fame, and her fortune, and who still, somehow, found meaning in the next morning. The fortune could not save them. Not from grief, not from the pressure of impossible expectations, not from the particular loneliness that settles into children who are famous before they understand what fame means. Money is extraordinarily good at certain things. It is good at building beautiful rooms and providing excellent educations, and ensuring that the material logistics of life are never a source of genuine suffering. It is completely useless, however, at filling the specific space that is left when a parent is emotionally absent, or when a marriage collapses, or when a father dies on an operating table leaving 2 young boys to figure out the rest on their own. The Vanderbilt children were not failed by money. They were failed by some of the same things that fail children in every tax bracket, in every country, in every era of human history. They were failed by the gap between love as intention and love as action. They were failed by grief that was not spoken aloud. They were failed, in some cases, by the specific pressures that come with being born into a name so large it was almost impossible to stand inside it without feeling very, very small. Anderson Cooper built a life anyway. He built a career on the principle of bearing witness to truth. He built a family of his own. He became, by most measures, one of the most respected figures in American journalism. He carries Carter with him. You can feel it in the texture of his work, in the way he refuses to sanitize suffering, in the way he sits with grieving people on camera and lets their pain be real rather than managed. Carter Cooper is 37 years gone now, and his absence is still present in every conversation about this family. He is the one who could not find a way through. He is the one whose pain, for whatever constellation of reasons, could not be survived. He is the one who has made this family's story a lesson rather than simply a biography. Because Carter's death, more than any of the wealth or the fame or the extraordinary public life that surrounded him, is the fact that most demands to be understood. Not explained away, not tidied into a simple narrative about mental illness or privilege or inadequate motherhood, but understood, held, allowed to be as complicated and as painful as it actually is. The Vanderbilt fortune, once enormous enough to build Grand Central Terminal and the Biltmore Estate, and reshape the entire American transportation network, filtered down through the generations until it reached Gloria's children as something both more and less than money. It reached them as a name, a reputation, a set of expectations, a particular kind of visibility that made ordinary suffering feel somehow inadmissible. It reached them as a birthright that was also a burden. And each of the four boys had to decide, in his own time and his own way, what to do with what he had been given. Two of them chose distance. One of them chose witness. One of them chose, on a July evening in 1988, to end the conversation entirely. None of those choices can be fully explained by the fortune. None of them can be fully explained by the mother. Human beings are not simply the sum of their circumstances, no matter how extraordinary those circumstances are. Carter Cooper was not simply a product of the Vanderbilt legacy. He was a person, a complete and irreducible person, who was suffering in ways that the people around him could sense but not fully reach. And his death is not a verdict on his mother or his family or the American aristocracy. It is simply one of the most painful things that can happen. A young person who could not find a way to stay. What Gloria Vanderbilt did with the decades she lived after Carter's death tells you something essential about her character. She did not stop. She did not retreat into a private mourning that consumed everything else. She kept painting. She kept writing. She kept loving, including loving the son who had estranged himself from her, from a distance and then up close. She kept being present, in the way she was capable of being present, which was not always the way her children needed, but was always the way she knew. She made it to 95. She held her grandson Wyatt. She reconciled with Christopher. She wrote her way through the story of her own life until she had nothing left to add. And then, on a June morning in 2019, she let go. The name Vanderbilt still carries weight in America. It still calls up images of gilded mansions and railroad empires, and the particular mythologized version of old money that Americans have always been simultaneously fascinated by and suspicious of. But the real story of the Vanderbilt name in the 20th and 21st century is not about those mansions. It is about four boys who grew up in the long shadow of an extraordinary woman, each finding his own relationship with the light and the dark of that shadow. It is about what inheritance actually means when you strip away the romance of it. Not money, not property, not even legacy in the formal sense, but the deeper inheritance, the emotional language you are handed without being asked, the patterns of love and absence and survival that you absorb before you are old enough to choose what to do with them. The fortune could not save them from any of that. Only time could do that. And the willingness to look clearly at where you come from, to understand it without being destroyed by it, to carry the grief and the beauty of it forward into a life that is genuinely, stubbornly your own. Anderson Cooper named his son Wyatt. Gloria Vanderbilt died with her hand held. Carter Cooper lives in the space between every sentence of this story, and the Vanderbilt name, worn and storied and emptied of its billions, carries on, carrying all of them with it. Some legacies are built in stone and steel. Some are built in the harder, quieter materials. in the conversations finally had, in the names given to children, in the work done by people who refuse to let grief become the whole story. In the grace, imperfect and hard one, of families who find their way back to each other across the distances that pain creates. Gloria Vanderbilt's children inherited a name. What they did with the weight of it, each in his own way, is the real story. And like all real stories, it does not end cleanly. It simply continues, carried by the living into whatever comes next.